So welcome to Open Data Week. I'm Rodney Chun. I am the chief economist here at the New York City Office of Management and Budget. And today we're going to talk about seasonally adjustments of the New York City employment data. This is our group. Quan Tran's my unit head, I believe all these people are on right now. Sarah Mercer, is a senior analyst, and Ben Schwartz. What I want to talk about today first is, because this is a very general office, I just want to describe briefly what the OMB does for New York City. Then I want to go into a little bit about, how do we measure economic activity in the city and why it turns out the employment data is so useful, and what characteristics it has that make it very timely. And then go into some of the seasonality problems that we run into in using higher frequency data like the employment data. And then so the seasonal adjustment process is driven largely by how the statistical agencies, which would be the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and the New York State Department of Labor, how they actually do their revisions and their ultimately benchmark revisions. And that's going to be important for doing the seasonal adjustment correctly. And then I'm going to speak briefly about some of the issues that arose due to the pandemic and then conclude. So without further ado, OMB, who are we? We are New York City's chief financial agency. Our core mission is essentially managing the city's resources and the budget, and making sure everything is funded. Our responsibilities are listed there. I mean, we do a lot of budgeting, obviously, as OMB, both expense budgets and capital budgets. To fund that, we do lots of estimates of revenues, of tax revenues and fees and other revenues. We're an oversight of all the city agencies in terms of expenditures. The management side, which our current budget director always says, I want to work on the management side, is looking at how cost effective we are at spending money at the city level. And then also in conjunction with the city controller, we implement and manage the city's borrowing and bond programs. So large as the country's largest municipal borrower. So real quickly, let's just take a 30,000-foot view of, how do we measure economic activity and at a city level. And it's actually quite difficult. An ideal indicator should be representative, comprehensive, accurate, timely, and hopefully with a long history, right? That spans many business cycles, so that you can see how these patterns persist over a business cycle period of time. National level, of course, real GDP is by far the most popular measure that people dwell on. At the city level, we're much more constrained because they're actually, when I started working for OMB, we didn't even have a GDP at a county level. We had we made a synthetic version of it called gross city product. Since then, at 2020, the BEA, excuse me, began to actually publish county level GDP figures. And by aggregating over the 5 counties in New York City, we can now have a city level GDP that's released by the BEA. Unfortunately, at least at the city level, for these county GDP measures, they have huge publication lags, about 12 months, and it's only available at an annual frequency. The official data starts in 2001. And to our surprise, one major drawback was so every 5 years, BEA does what's called a comprehensive update of all their national income accounts. And we discovered that they did not, at least at the county level, extend those changes back to the beginning of the sample. So basically there was a break in 2017, which is what their new base year was. Which threw us for a loop because yeah, there was basically a large break in 2017. Just to back up a little bit, you know, where my group fits and why we're interested in these types of questions is we do the forecast for you know, the New York City budget for New York City. And that economic forecast is used in determining things like tax revenues over the next 4 or 5 years. So obviously the keeping a thumb on economic activity is sort of crucial to that process of forecasting. So anyway, let me move on. So what other candidates do we have for, you know, a gross measure or a large scale measure of economic activity? Personal income, which is published also by BEA. It's an 11-month lag. It's available quarterly. Wage earnings, it's about a 6-month lag for New York City, quarterly. And then we get to jobs data. BLS, US BLS, and the New York Department of Labor publish a number of series that are useful in that regard. The two most popular are the Current Employment Statistics, or the CES survey, which is a 1-month lag, and it was available every month. The Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, QCEW, available with a 6-month lag, and it comes quarterly. It does have monthly detail, but people tend to use it only quarterly. And the Current Population Survey, CPS, a 1-month lag is monthly, and it's mainly a survey of households. And so the most timely in that list are 1 and 3. The CES monthly survey and the CPS survey, which is actually the CPS is the source of things like the unemployment rate. So let's do a quick comparison of those 3 employment items. I'll make the slides available, so you don't have to like scribble this down, but because there's a lot of information here. But basically, this table takes those 3 jobs sources, job data sources, and does a comparison of, you know, where they're coming from, how frequently are they revised, things like that. So just really quickly, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but basically the CES, which is the one we're going to dwell on, is a survey of employers. So that's why it's sometimes called the establishment survey. Is available monthly, as I mentioned before. In terms of seasonally adjusted series, it has sectoral details, but the only seasonally adjusted series that's provided by the State Department of Labor and /BLS is the top line total employment. All the other sectoral data is just straight raw, unadjusted data. So sectoral details, yes. Employment details, it's counted. It's counted as at your place of work, where your job is, and it's the number of jobs. Benchmark, or a benchmark is a revision of annual revision. I'll define that in a little bit, but it is annually benchmarked or synced up or anchored to the QCEW data here, which is considered a better source or more reliable source of data. Sample size, it's hard to actually, I've asked DOL about this, and it's not published anywhere, but at the state level, it's about 18,000 employers. And if you share that down by, you know, the number of establishments, it means that it's probably something around 8,000 New York City employers. And then there's some notes in there about what they're counting. The QCEW, as I implied, is considered a much more reliable source of jobs data, but it's only available. It's typically available at a quarterly frequency, and it's lagged about 6 months. And the source of the data is, and the reason that it's considered more accurate is the source of the data is actually coming from unemployment insurance programs, statewide unemployment insurance programs. So anyone who's working a job that's covered by unemployment insurance is, their firms or establishments are filing data on those UI programs to the state, and the state's collecting that as administrative data. And it's considered a near census of every firm in either the state or the city. It is not seasonally adjusted, so what you get is what you get. It's just raw data. There is sectoral detail. It's also place of work. The one last thing I in the notes there, I have this cryptic note that says there's some non-covered employment. So there are some entities or some employers in the that are missing from the QCW that the CES tries to impute or count. These are oddities. There's strange things like, security agencies like the CIA or the NSA or something, for security reasons, doesn't, I guess. I don't know what happens if you get fired from the FBI, if you get unemployment insurance or not, but they certainly aren't collecting that data and publishing it because it's a security risk. But there are some other parts that are not covered. They say it's about 3%. So there's about a 3% difference between what the ground truth total employment would be and the counts that you would get out of the QCW. And then finally, in that last column is the current population survey, CPS. It's also colloquially known as the household survey. It's, as I say here, it's a survey of New York City households. It's also monthly. There's no seasonal adjustment in the raw data. Some of the variables that are derived from it, like the unemployment rate, I believe are seasonally adjusted. Yes, the unemployment rate is seasonally adjusted. So there is some seasonally adjusted series coming out of that. And one thing I want to point out, to be careful about, it is really, really small. It's only, they do publish their counts of their survey frame, and it's only about 1,200 New York City households. So I believe there are about 3 million households in New York City. So, I mean, it is a tiny sample compared to the entire size of the New York City population. So I always use some caution when you're doing anything with the CPS or the unemployment rates, the labor force participation rates, labor force, stuff like that. Just keep in the back of your head that it's a small sample. Okay. So let's turn now to the CES, which now is the highest frequency, seasonally adjusted, there's some seasonal adjustment availability. Let's talk a little bit about what is available at the state and the metro level. At the state level, BLS and Department of Labor publish, and it's the same data, both the non-adjusted and seasonally adjusted data at total, private, public, and all the sector levels. I'll talk a little bit about how we define the sectors. Higher level sectors are aggregations of components. Okay, so this is what's called an indirect seasonal adjustment. So if I have a component X and it's a sector that's component has two subsectors, Y and Z, what they do is they seasonally adjust Y and Z and then sum up to X to get what now they call an indirect seasonal adjustment of X. So at the metro area and New York City in particular, we get non-adjusted data at total, private, public, and all the sectors, but only get, as I mentioned before, seasonally adjusted data at the highest level. The adjustment to that highest level that they publish is direct. Okay, so they do not start at the subsector level and sum up to get total. What they do is they use that total series directly and run a seasonal adjustment on that series alone. And it's interesting. I found this one statistic at the bottom bullet. BLS apparently, publishes 19,000 series total, of which only 2,000 are actually seasonally adjusted, and it's mostly, the state level data that's being seasonally adjusted. So where does that leave us? Well, it means that, we as a city, even though we have 8 million, a population of 8 million, and over 4 million jobs, we do not get, and which is larger than many states, by the way, we do not get seasonally adjusted sectoral data. And that's why OMB has and others have always tried to address this deficiency by publishing our own. Okay, just for those of you who are not used to looking at this data and the sectors in it, I mentioned there's a hierarchy of sectors, and the standard that we use is called the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS, which doesn't really roll off your tongue, but that's when people aren't having tics when they say this. It's NAICS codes. By hierarchical, we mean that, here's an example. A particular sector is defined by say a 2-digit number, 51. It's hierarchical in that you have other subsectors that are part of information, and they're given longer numbers, like that start with 5.1. So 5.12 is motion picture and sound recording. 5.13 is publishing industries, etc. Right? So you can stack all these up. You can actually go all the way out to 6-digit numbers, which are very finely, refined numbers. Now, at least I don't know nationally or at the state level, but certainly at the New York City level, when you start getting to these 3-digit NAICS codes, you run into what's called a small cell problem. For confidentiality reasons, and survey reasons, once you get down to finer and finer subsectors, you start violating certain rules about how many establishments are represented by that particular observation. I believe they want to have, I think they need to have more than 20 employers in any cell, and they don't want any one employer to be more than 50% of the cell, because they don't want people to be able to identify, violate confidentiality. So what they do even at the 3-sector level here, is that they compute them. It's actually coming out of a model, and that's the way they're estimating those numbers. Yes. Let's see. Oh, the one last thing I wanted to say about the NAICS codes is that notice that the definition of, jobs are categorized this way, and the definition of where your job falls, or where the position falls, is defined by the activity or process of the employer. And this is a subtle but often confused point. It's not your occupation. So suppose I'm broadcasting right now from very close to the World Trade Center, and at World Trade Floor, I think, is Spotify. And so suppose you were a lawyer, and they got lots of them at Spotify, right? Working on intellectual property and contracting and everything, but you're working for Spotify. So it turns out Spotify is categorized in 5.12 here, motion picture and sound recording. Even though you're a lawyer, right? There is this other category under professional and business services for legal services. You're not classified under legal services. You're classified, because you're working for Spotify, you're classified under motion picture and sound recording. So as far as the CES job numbers are concerned, you're working for motion picture and sound recording, and you fall in the information sector. This often is a confusing thing when people talk about tech workers. Tech workers are spread out all over the place. They could be in finance, they could be Spotify, they could be, Uber, you know, they get anything, but it's very hard to uh, to tease that out. What, you know, the actual number of tech workers. I think Jason Branham, who's on this call from the New York City Controller, when he was at the Fed, actually wrote a very useful blog on tech workers, and he went through the process of trying to tease out what sectors are going to be heavy in tech workers and sum up over those. We actually used that those categories. Um, so let me talk briefly about what we publish. So what we're publishing is, again, it's, you know, there are, if you look at what the Department of Labor issues in their monthly report, there are 102 non-adjusted series in that report. Of those, we only publish 28 seasonally adjusted series, but we try and you know, these are at the highest level that we hope are not, we don't know actually, but we're fairly certain that at least at the 2 level or higher super sector level, that these are not being generated by, you know, a computer algorithm, but they're actually coming from the survey itself. So this is sort of the organization of how we publish our data. Obviously, total and private. Then we have all these super sectors like financial activities, and these are the, you know, the pieces that make up financial activities: professional business services, education and health services, leisure, hospitality, trade, transportation, and utilities, and construction, manufacturing, and government. So that's sort of the way we think about the structure of the New York City labor market. And my bullet point there is, yeah, that many 3-digit subsectors and smaller model outputs. Okay. So let's turn now to the seasonality. Is there seasonality in the employment data? Oh, yes, there is. So what this picture is showing you is the raw data for total employment in blue. The red data, red line there is our seasonally adjusted total employment series after we get done processing it. Ours is an indirect seasonal adjustment. What we do is, let me go back, we're seasonally adjusting these pieces, right? And then summing those up into the total, which gives us the red line. You know, it's remarkable how regular these patterns are. It's basically December is this high point peak, and January is the low point trough there, and it repeats over and over again. And as I was putting this presentation together, I mean, it's even after this pandemic, which is right here in 2020, this is COVID, with this huge drop in employment, you still see actually even that year, sort of the seasonality reemerging in hiring patterns. So it is a very strong, regular phenomenon in the New York City data. So again, going back to why do we do this? Okay, suppose you were tasked with forecasting these lines, right? Which one would you rather forecast, the red line or the blue line? And I hope you'd agree it's going to be a bit easier to forecast the red lines. The other thing that's useful in the seasonally adjusted data is it's easier to see where the turning points are, right, during these business cycles. You know, these peaks here and here, certainly here, and definitely the turning points of the troughs, instead of having, you know, all this volatility going on. So what I wanted to show you though is that this is the total, right? There are sectors, you know, in that hierarchy I showed you, that's summing up to make the pattern you're seeing here, the seasonal pattern you're seeing here. And what I want to show you is pictures from various sectors that they have each a different seasonally adjusted pattern, seasonal pattern. And that's why it's useful to do it at a sectoral level instead of just at the top level. So, um, so we're going to change our viewpoint a little bit here in these slides. So what we're looking at on these bars here is they're dark bars and light bars. The dark bar is the 9 year, actually, let me back up. So this is a very nice period, right? This was the longest expansion actually in the data we have. And I think it was the longest expansion in US history, employment history, and the data goes a lot further back. So this is a nice stretch to make the following comparisons I'm going to make here. So the dark bars are that 9 year stretch there, and this is the average monthly change for each of the months in that 9 year stretch. So you see this big, for total, this big January plunge, right? And then, the monthly gains become positive in the spring. There's a summer lull here, and then hiring picks up again in the fall as people come back from vacations and school starts and things like that. The lighter bars in these are 2023, the most recent data, which came out last week. And the only reason I put those there are two. One, I wanted to show that the patterns look the same. And secondly, just in terms of the magnitude, I wanted to show that, the seasonal patterns that we saw before the pandemic have, for all intents and purposes, renormalized in the 2023 data, and it gives us hope that things are returning to normal. But the one other thing I wanted to point out is where you see, the whole gist of seasonal adjustment is to say, where is a particular month's observation gain or loss? Where is it abnormal, or is it an outlier? Is it stronger than what we saw in the past? So I just wanted to use these charts as a heuristic to say, well, let's take construction, for instance. Here's the dark orange is, a typical construction pattern. It's obviously driven by weather, right? So the spring, construction picks up, and when it gets colder in November and December, it drops off. But just to do this sort of heuristic seasonal adjustment, let's look at May here. May in 2023 was really strong relative to what it was a typical May in over the last 9 years before the pandemic. So in our seasonally adjusted data, we want to say that was a strong month, and that was significantly stronger than what we've seen in average. And that's all that what seasonal adjustment is doing. It's basically saying, okay, there's this pattern that we've seen in the past. Let's sort of subtract that out and then see what's left. And in this case, you would say, well, that looked like an up month compared to what we would normally see. This is definitely a down month compared to what we would normally see. Construction is tough, however, because it's largely weather driven. A lot of it is weather driven. But let's look at some more. Financial activities. I never thought financial activities would have a seasonal pattern, but New York City finance, I think, I don't know, but I'm speculating that this is hiring as undergraduates and graduates come out of school and are, sign on with various banks and securities firms and hedge funds and whatever. And then in September, you have sort of a reversal of that, right? As people go back to school or leave, they're going to grad school or whatever, and they might leave the firm. So you see these seasonal patterns there. Education, definitely driven by this is education services, driven by the semester. Summer, you have we call them layoffs, but we have a slow period going into the summer, and then a lot strong hiring going into the fall semester. Let's see, two more. Leisure and hospitality, as you would expect, as it gets warmer, more hiring. There's a bit of a lull in the summer, and then hiring here in the third and fourth quarters, as tourism picks up actually in the fall. The fourth quarter is actually the strongest tourism quarter for New York City. And likewise, trade, transportation, and utilities. So a very strong fall. So notice that each one of these has a slightly different pattern. I mean, there's a summer lull, there's a January drop, but there are other things driving each of these sectors. And that's why we think that it's better to have the seasonal adjustment done at the sectoral level instead of just going for the top level total employment and just doing it there. Okay. Let's see. I'm running, time is short, so let's move on. So the data is revised several times, and any seasonal adjustment has to consider the monthly revisions and annual benchmarks. So a monthly revision is a change to a prior observation, usually the second to last or penultimate observation, and that incorporates new data. An annual benchmark, on the other hand, is a wholesale update of an entire period. And in our case, it's typically 21 months. Data, and we'll see, I'll illustrate this in a second in more detail, but data for any given month is revised twice and then altered again during the annual benchmark exercises. So just other terms, I'll often say reference month, which is just the month of the observation, and I might use the word vintage, which means when is that data published? So it's a way of tracking when is the version of the data. So this is actually this diagram is current as of today. Here's where we sit. Every March, combined with the January data release, BLS and DOL released a benchmark, and it syncs the monthly CES data with the QCEW data. And because the QCEW data, as I mentioned, has this long lag, they have to do it in pieces. So remember, red, green, blue. Those are the pieces, 1, 2, and 3. So we're sitting here in March 2024. The Department of Labor has just released the report for the January reference month, 24. And they've also released this big wholesale 21-month revision that consists of 3 different parts. They have older QCW data that's considered final. And starting with March of last year, March 23, going back 12 months, they do a replacement. They do some imputations of that missing uncovered population, and they also do there's some other details which I won't go into here, dealing with their birth-death model, but take it, just the way to think about it, they do a replacement. Then this green part 2, is they have preliminary QCW data, which actually might be revised later on, and they have 6 months of that. So they replaced the April through September piece with that preliminary QCW data. And that's where the QCW runs out. They don't have anything after that. So what are they going to do? Well, this other piece is put together starting from the September observation using growth rates and any additional data they have. So, but it really is the survey data, right? And that they're using here. So the upshot is there are these parts. Let me put it in another chart like this. And this again corresponds to what I just spoke of. The monthly estimates start with initial or preliminary estimates, which are, I'm calling estimate 1 here. And these are X's, denoted by X's. And suppose we're waiting for the December report. When the December report comes out, you get a December first estimate, and then they update the penultimate month with a revised estimate Y. So November now is a second estimate. Then we get the January report, which is when they do the benchmark, and this happens. You get a preliminary January number, and you get all of these benchmark numbers, which are follow the process I just described in my last slide. And that's how it's done. So the upshot is there are actually two pieces, and therefore the CES sample here consists of a QCW or universe-based, UI-based piece of sample and a CES survey-based piece. And they have different seasonal patterns. There's been a lot of research done on this when Berger and Phillips here argued for a two-step approach to adjust each section separately. A naive way, and the way that BLS used to do it until 1994, is, let me go back, just run your seasonal adjustment on the Z's there, right? And ignore the fact that these are two different data generating processes. We used to do that until 2018. That creates all sorts of artifacts that are avoidable. Burgess and Phillips, which I have listed here, were the first to, they were at the Dallas Fed. They argued for that, these artifacts are avoidable. Why don't we do it in another way? And that's what we're going, that was adopted by BLS, and that's the way we're now doing it. And that's called a two-step seasonal adjustment. So the QCW part is actually long enough. Let me go back. This diagram is useful. The Z part here, the green and the red, extends. You can imagine the Z going all the way back to 1990. It's really long. So, and it can be adjusted in using, standard methods. However, the CES section, there's not enough data. There's only, well, starting out here, we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 observations in the CES survey part. And that will grow as, February, March, April are released, but it's nowhere close to the 5 years or so of data that you need to actually to generate seasonal factors or seasonal adjustments, weights. So Berger and Phillips had a creative solution to this lack of data. So it's they proposed save all the initial estimates, the first estimates, the X series in my cool table there. That'll unfortunately contain seams or breaks every January when the new benchmark is released. But they suggested a way around that, which I'll talk about in a second. And then generate your seasonal factors or seasonal weights using that adjusted X series and not the Z series, and then use those factors that you generate there for your seasonal weights in the CES section. So essentially we're saving all of this data, the X data, and there's a problem here. Any shaded cell in this table here means that the data is post benchmark. It contains information from the benchmark. So the problem, the seam, is that if you just looked at, say, growth rates between this X December and this X January, you're going from a non-shaded cell to a shaded cell, right? So the benchmark is creating a break in there, and that's a seam. So the upshot was they suggested, Berger and Phillips suggested, using the growth rates between this gray cell and this blue cell here. It's December to January. They're both post benchmark, and it has, it's much smoother. And I just wanted to show you that point exactly. If you just look at the gray, the X December to X January change, the January is normally a negative drop. You get these gray bars in that 9-year period. If you go across from the benchmark December to the benchmark January, you get a much bigger drop, right? So this is consequences for if you're estimating weights to essentially eliminate these types of drops. Using the gray one would underestimate, the size of your gain or loss in January. So we do what they suggest. We actually saved up all the data. What you do is you create this, every time you have a seam, you create this ratio of these two values, and you use it to make a constructed series iterating backwards or backcasting. Once you've created that constructed series, then you use that series, this hybrid series, there's, excuse me, not hybrid, but synthetic series, to generate your seasonal adjustment factors, and then you apply that to the data, to the unadjusted data, the CES portion. And that's what we're doing. Just a quick word, we're using the Census X13 methodology. It's an industry standard. It really is it's interesting. It's non-parametric. It comes from these roots when back in the 60s when they didn't have like heavy computers, lots of time series facilities and theory. And so they were doing it all with these filters, which are moving average processes, really clever ones, right? You can actually identify 12-month frequencies and remove them by applying a filter. And they do it iteratively. I'll let you guys, if you want details about it, the manual that the US Census has on it is actually a good read for data nerds. It's about 300 pages long. And in the back of this presentation, I have a lot of citations that actually have useful references in. So yeah, so basically, in addition to the seasonal process, it also tries to adjust for holiday effects, trading day effects, trends, shifts, outliers, which is important. I may mention in a second. And also the software is the same software and is generally available in any statistical package. Okay, so the result. So here is, I'm sort of zooming in on that one of the total employment figure that I had earlier. And this is showing what the unadjusted data is in blue versus our seasonal adjustment, indirect, in red. And the DOL does give us the one total non-farm employment seasonally adjusted series, and that's green. And as you can see, A, it's a lot smoother, and B, the red and green lines are tracking very closely. They're not perfect, but generally over the course of a year, it's basically it comes out almost the same, which gives us, even though they're using different methodologies to be generated in different ways, it's good that they should be pretty close to each other. Just as some examples of this results sectorally, construction is smoother. It still has all these bumps in it. Education is very cyclical, right? But the seasonally adjusted version of it is much smoother. And like I said, we forecast the darker lines, and it's much easier to forecast the darker lines. Okay, real quick, since time is short, the one thing that happened during COVID that was documented is there was a seasonal echo now embedded in some of the factors. And you can see this here. This is using what's called multiplicative factors. When you do the seasonal adjustment, you have a choice whether to use to adjust using multiplicative factors or additive factors. The multiplicative factors are typically the ones that are used, but they tend to exaggerate when you have large fluctuations. And see the blue lines here? This is the big jump in employment as we recovered from the pandemic closures. They get echoed over here a year later. And this was first noted in the after the global financial crisis, that this was happening at the national level in national employment data. What we did to avoid and to mute this effect is we switched to additive factors, and that's the red bars here. And you can see it did tamp it down a little bit. There's still strength here because we're we were sort of coming out of the pandemic. Things were starting to improve. So there is strong month-over-month growth, but as you can see, we tamped down on the impact of that. So here's the switches in methodology that we have now implemented. In the X13 seasonal adjustment software, there's a feature that you can designate certain periods as outliers, or even observations as outliers. So that's what we've done. We've taken this section during the pandemic and just said, we're not using it as an input into our estimation of factors. In essence, we're dummying those out. And then what we've done is we had multiplicative factors before the pandemic. We're using additive factors for this pandemic period. And as of last week, we're returning to multiplicative factors from now until the next disaster. Hopefully, a long time, I hope we'll be at multiplicative. I hope there's not another hurricane or pandemic. So, in conclusion, the CES and QCW data are their main sources of our employment data. Seasonally adjusted data at the New York City sectoral level is unavailable, so we do it ourselves. You have to be really careful about the benchmarks and revisions to do this properly. And the pandemic messed us all up. So, you know, there's some volatility there due to our changes in methodology. And that's it. Thank you.
Rodney, I put together all the questions. I
Okay.
can just go over them. Okay. From Dan Eldridge. Who conducts the survey? The survey of approximately 1,200 households. Is it household or individuals?
The household survey, you're asking who does the actual survey, or
who conducts the survey?
Yeah, I think that's Census and BLS is a joint project.
But it might be individuals, right? Is it? I know it's a survey of households, but I think they actually survey every person in the household.
Yes, I think that's true. That is true.
Next one, a few questions from Igor. So an employee is categorized depending on what the employing business markets?
Correct. It's your employer that sort of sets the label that gets attached to your job. And it could be you're a computer programmer, but you're working for Uber, and you might be classified in transportation, for instance, just because Uber is transportation. And even though your occupation is, you know, computer science or data engineer or something like that, yeah, it's Uber that determines your label.
So Berger and Phillips distinguishes EW and CES data for the purpose of removing avoidable seasonal artifacts.
Berger and Phillips are the ones who identified that the CES series is hybrid, and that, you know, the vast majority of of that, you know, if you go to the Department of Labor and download their CES series, the vast majority of it has been benchmarked. Like 1990 to 2023 has been benchmarked, which means it reflects the QCW patterns. But the most recent data and every subsequent release is actually coming from the survey data, not this universe UI administrative data. And so therefore, the CES portion of it has a different seasonal pattern to it.
Okay, two more questions. So data is adjusted by benchmark that gives different weight to statistic based on factors like trading days, outliers, and trends. Okay. And then last one is, the Department of Labor and Office of Budget Management use different software, but get a similar result in terms of smoothing the seasonal pulse.
Well, my guess is that the software is identical. You know, actually, if you were good at digging around in computers, for instance, we use eViews, which is you know, a statistical package. They might, you know, I don't know what they're using, but you know, if you're using R or SPSS or SAS or anything like that, it turns out the census makes the executable programs that implements its methodology available to these software companies, and it's basically, I think, the same software internally. So now the reason that it's slightly different. Our results are slightly different between the Department of Labor and what we generate is because we're doing what's called an indirect seasonal adjustment, whereas the Department of Labor is doing a direct seasonal adjustment. And that explains what the small change differences are between the two series.